Dear students, welcome to another session from the course Methodology of Literature. In today's session, we will talk about New Criticism and Russian Formalism. This is from Module 2, and this can be the continuation of the Module 1, where we had a discussion on what literature was and what literature is. And also, we have talked about some of the, you know, different literatures, in different continents in the world. Say it African American, Canadian, Australian, then British, as well as Indian English writings. In this session, we will talk about Russian formalism first, then we will talk about new criticism as well. So this module is expected to give you an idea of different ways of approaching a literary text, how to approach a literary text, how to read a literary text from different angles. Okay, that is what we try to do here in this module. So as a part of it, we would discuss new criticism and Russian formalism. So the word Russian formalism itself is quite self-explanatory in the sense that that gives us an idea what it actually means. Russian obviously gives us a hint that it is from Russia, and formalism is giving us the idea that it's related to form, it's concerned with form, right? So in traditional, when we say that in the history of English literature or in the history of literary criticism, there have been different approaches of reading a literary text. Sometimes literary works were mostly read historically. That means whenever we get a literary work, we try to analyze that literary text on the basis of the biography of the author or the age in which a work has been written. It's been produced, or sometimes the ideological or social affiliations of the author, or the psychological aspects of the author and the age. So all this would contribute to the interpretation of a literary text. So this has been done quite traditionally. Whereas we can also approach a text on the other way around. That means we can approach a text, without looking at any of this background information and just taking the text as it is and try to, find out, draw meaning from the text itself. So that's the second possibility. Of course, this approach cannot be called a new one because in literature we have always found this dichotomy between two people, two approaches. One is the approach that art is for art's sake, art for art's sake movements, aesthetic movements, which believe that any literary work should be written for its own sake. It should never serve any social, political, or didactic purpose in it. Why do we write a poem? Is just for the sake of expressing, you know, the feelings and emotions of a poet. Okay, why do readers want to read a poem? Simply because they want to get pleasure out of it. So a thing of beauty is a joy forever. The lines taken from Keats was often used as a matter of slogan for the aesthetic movement. So which actually flourished in the second half of the 19th century, headed by people like Walter Pater, Oscar Wilde, Christina Rossetti, and many others. Whereas in the 21st century, we have writers like Bernard Shaw, who believed that literature should have a political aim or a social aim. Okay, he has said that he would not waste even a single drop of ink for writing something for its own sake. It's a paraphrased statement. So the thing is that these two approaches can be quite visible whenever we talk about literature from two perspectives. One is the historical approach, the other one is the approach which is more concerned about the form. So perhaps when we talk about this Russian formalism, they belong to the second category, not the first category, I would say. They were more concerned about the literary form, the style, than the content, than the subject matter of a literary work. So when we talk about it, we will talk about that first. So Russian formalists, were a group of writers who flourished during the period of Russian Revolution of 1917. This age has a significance. Okay, even though Russian formalists were not concerned about the age of a literary work, we should be concerned about the age when we talk about Russian formalists, because this was age of revolution where the Russian government especially wanted the writers to succumb to their whims and fancies. That means the writers were expected to support the cause of the proletarians. The writers were expected to promote the policies of the government through their writings. Their writings should have a social commitment. What they promoted what we call committed literature. Okay, this is the first point we have to remember. It was in this background that some of the writers, in fact, deviated from that affirmed position, and believed that literature should be read not for any political purpose, or it should not be for any social cause. It is for its own sake. So this movement, in fact, uh, drew irks and, of course, sulky response from the people from the government, if not staunch opposition. Of course, they too faced even that. So when we talk about this Russian formalism, we have two groups. One is the Moscow Linguistic Circle, which was headed by Roman Jakobson. That was formed in 1915, and it has members like Osip Borik and Boris Tamorsky. And the second group was the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, or POYAS, uh, which was founded in 1916. And the leading figures included Victor Klosky, one of the prominent figures in it. Uh, so it should be said that Russian formalists, they emphasized on form and technique. So perhaps when we talk about new critics that we will discuss after Russian formalism, we find that they too have the same approach to reading a text, because they also viewed that literary piece or literary works need not be written in a literary work need not be written, what you can say, uh, historically. It should be, we need not go back into the literary text. We need not try to, what you can say, dig out the past of the author. We should not place it against the political and economic background of the age in which that particular work has been produced. So they too have the same kind of approaches to reading a literary text, but there were differences between them. See, for example, when we talk about the formalists, their analysis were far more theoretical, seeking to understand the general nature of literature and literary devices, as well as the historical evolution of literary techniques. Okay, so that is what the Russian formalists were mostly concerned about. They were concerned about the what you can say, the what you can say, the general nature of literature and literary devices. Means they talked about literature in general. What constitutes a literary work? What makes a literary work in fact literary? What are the devices employed by a writer in order to have the effect of literariness? Okay, so their concerns were mostly general. Whereas when we come to so they were rather theorizations of the literariness, what constitutes literariness. Whereas when we talk about the new critics, see, they were concerned about the practice, basically. That means especially they prefer to read individual text. They prefer to subject you know the individual text to close reading, and they were trying to find out the how a work is to be called an autotelic one, something which is autonomous, something which contained a meaning in itself. So that was their approach, actually. So there is a difference, though their approach can be same. The way they actually undertook the mission of the formalist method or no critical method were different. So that also you have to keep in mind. And now, when we talk about this, literary work, one of the fresh and formalism, one of the things that comes to our mind is art as a technique, a seminal essay by Klosky, because that introduces the central concept of Russian formalism, that is defamiliarization. See, that is the one of the important contributions by Klosky to Russian formalism. Slowski believed that art is actually for making familiar things unfamiliar. Okay, when a familiar thing is presented in a familiar way, it does not arouse any curiosity. It does not have create any sensation. It does not hold our attention, right? So if we want to be excited by something, if our curiosity is to be aroused, it should be presented in an unfamiliar way. So writers do it. Sometimes we might wonder, why do these writers write in such an indirect way, in a complicated way, right? Creating troubles to the reader to understand the meaning of the poem, what the poet actually meant by those particular lines or expressions. So these idea may have come to your mind, may have stuck you a lot of time when you start reading a poem, right? Why do writers want to write like this? Why can't they write plainly? Okay, that's the question. But actually the answer is that, if something is written in a quite plain, explicit way, then it does not hold any sensation. It doesn't have any meaning at all. It will be simply, an automatic process to read a particular thing because we know what it is. But whereas when we read a text which contains a lot of unfamiliar words and expressions, or things which are presented in a defamiliarized way, what will happen is, that will give us that gives a kind of sensation, right? So that is why, according to Slosky, this is an important literary device, that is defamiliarization, that gives literary work the quality of being literary. Okay, so he says, as our normal perceptions become habitual, they become automatic. Formalism, he was actually speaking about defamiliarization as a technique. See, this is what he says. As our normal perception become habitual, they become automatic and unconscious. For example, when we see something regularly, it will lose to have any sensation in our mind. We'll become unconscious of its presence itself, right? For example, there is a beautiful thing that we see that we actually see every day. Okay, so what happens really is that when we see it every day, naturally we will stop caring it, because it will not be any attractive at all, because that's a normal perception. Any normal perception will naturally become habitual, and any habitual action will be simply automatic and monotonous, boring, etc. So that's why in everyday speech, we leave phrases unfinished, words half expressed. Because if we say everything completely, then it has no meaning, right? It becomes quite boring. But if we leave something unsaid, suppose we don't make everything explicit, the listener will be forced to think about what we really meant by that, and that makes it really exciting. Okay, so this is the point we want to remember, according to Slosky, when we talk about Russian formalism. Yes, let me give. Okay, this is what he says. Art exists that one may recover the sensation of life. It exists to make one feel things, to make the stone stony. So what makes a stone stony is the quality of literariness, the artistic quality of that stone, right? So if it is an ordinary stone, when it is done in presented in a different way, we will our attention will be drawn to that stone. For example, a stone having something engraved on it, or a beautifully carved stone, we would look at it because that is something unusual, right? So anything that is not ordinary, something that will force us to think differently or feel differently will have the lasting quality in it. Okay, so the technique of art is to make objects unfamiliar, to make forms difficult, to increase the difficulty and length of perception, because the process of perception is an aesthetic and itself and must be prolonged. So the more delayed is something, the more interesting it will be. For example, we read a poem and we are not able to understand that poem. We read it again and again, then we finally get the meaning. So that process of reading it again and again is an interesting, exciting, inspiring process. Okay, so that is the end is not important. The way you are, the final meaning that you get from the poem is not very important. What is more important is the process through which you arrive at the meaning. That means that the destination is not important. The journey is important. For example, let me give a very material introduction example. See, we make a journey to some places. Okay, and finally we reach there. For example, we take a flight and we reach that particular place in 1 hour, right? And we see that place and we come back. See, that will not be interesting at all. Suppose you take a lot of risk, maybe on a bike or maybe your own driving your own car or something. You take a lot of risk and you go there. You have a lot of difficulties on the way, and you have problems, health problems, other problems, the braving the climate. You finally reach the destination, and this journey would be remembered most of the time than the other one. That is likely to be forgotten. You will forget the other journey which you took so comfortably, right? So the idea is this, the more prolonged uh, a process is, the more interesting it will be. So that is aesthetic, and the perception will be delayed. We will not be able to easily understand something. Then that becomes really interesting in a way. For example, let me give you another example. When you come to class on one fine morning, you find that there is a sack, lying there, having something in it, if, that is there on the corner of the class. And immediately the teacher comes and you don't get time to go and see what is inside that sack. It appears like what you can say watermelon, or it appears like maybe coconut, it may be pumpkin. You don't know what it is, but something similar to that. But you are not sure whether it is whether it contains pumpkins, or whether it contains coconuts, or whether it contains anything as watermelon or something. You are not sure, but it appears having the shape of that one. So your curiosity is aroused till the class is over. That means you cannot go and see it, when the class is in progress. So you are waiting for this a period to end, and immediately when the teacher goes out of the class, you go and open it and find out what is in it. Okay. So till that moment, your attention is drawn to that particular object. You begin to ruminate over it, right? You begin to ponder over what would be inside that sack. Your curiosity, your inquisitiveness is aroused, and that give you a kind of sensation, right? So this is what that, for example, the same thing, there a sack in the corner of the class which has a label pasted on it, that is coconuts or watermelon. Then the moment you see the label, your attention will be lost. That means, it does not actually have any sense of seriosity, because you know what is inside, right? So this is a process. When you name something, when you make the meaning very explicit, that moment itself, the our interest will die out. Whereas if the meaning is delayed, the process, that is the perception, the final meaning is delayed, the way we try to understand something is delayed, then our pleasure out of that prolonged process will be more interesting. So that is what we say. So when we have, suppose, there are people I know, instead of going directly through a particular road, they will take a different long route to reach a particular destination. What is it for? Because they feel that, if you go, for example, you are coming to college every day in the same bus, in the same time, maybe in the same route. Okay. Suppose you take a different route every day. You feel that, every day is different. Otherwise, it may be just a repetition of the previous day, right? So this is the ultimate thing about art also. That means, it gives us a new sensation of life when it is done in an unfamiliar way. That is defamiliarization. So this is what he says. Art is a way of experiencing the artfulness of an object. And the object is not important. To feel the artfulness of an object is more important. As I told you, journey is not important, but the way we experience, sorry, the destination is not important, but the journey is more important. Okay, so such a thing is there. Another person, like Klosky, Asian Bomb was one of the leaders of this movement. That is the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, which was founded in 1916. And he was denounced by Trotsky, and but anyway, he wrote this as a theory of formal method, where also he expounded the evolution of the central principle of the formalist method. In fact, Eikenbaum begins by stating that formalism is characterized only by the attempt to create an independent science of literature, which studies specifically literary material. So, see, one of the commonalities we may find, some of the common grounds that we find between Russian formalism and new criticism is that both try to look at literature quite objectively, looking at certain objective features and try to judge a literary work or literature in general on the basis of the other. So literature was more or less equated with what you can say. Literature was more or less equated with what to say science. Okay, let us. This is what it is. The formalists sought to isolate the study of literature from secondary incidental features that might belong to philosophy, psychology, history, etc. See, when you get a literary work, when you get a literary work, uh, you are not looking at any supporting materials to understand and interpret that literary work or any other incidental features like philosophy. For example, the dominant philosophy that was prevalent at that period of time when this work was produced, or the psychology, that means the psychological approach of the writer, that was less important. For example, when we read Shakespeare's King Lear, people say that he was actually on the verge of madness when he wrote that particular play. So, or history, the historical background, which has a reference to it. For example, when we play, uh, for example, we can say it what I can say is history, what you can say, historical background of the things. When we talk about two cities, a tale of two cities, we are referring to the war between France and Britain. Or when we want to talk about, for example, Shakespeare's uh, Tempest, we are referring to the colonialism of Britain. So this way, but actually, formalists were against all this kind of readings. Connecting a literary work to the philosophical, psychological, historical backdrops of a literary work or the author. Okay, they were against that. When you get a text, you have to read it as it is, without going out of the text. You have to go inside the text and find out the literary devices, etc. See, when we talk about Slosky also, Slosky in that essay, Art as a Technique, in fact speaks about it. He speaks about what I can say. He speaks about what I would say, the some of the devices employed by the writers to have the effect of defamiliarization. For example, some writers use foreign words in their ordinary language. Sometimes they use archaic words. They may use riddles, because that will confuse the reader, or they will have the reverted sentences. And there he cites an example of Leo Tolstoy's story. Klosky quotes that one. There, a horse comes as a narrator in a story, and the horse speak about man's greed and man's meaningless quest for private property. Okay, so having employed a horse as a narrator, Tolstoy has tried to, you know, bring about a new effect and new sensation when we read the story. So, and Ebermann, coming back to him, quotes, Jacobson, the object of the science of literature is not literature, but literariness, that which makes a given work a work of literature. So, what the Russian formalists in general attempted doing was what makes a work literally worthy of a piece of literature. Okay, what gives it the literariness? So that is the more important, that is more important than the literature itself. Okay, the literariness that is contained in a piece of work. So this is what the Russian formalist did. So with this, we just wind up this session, brief session today. So we just talked about the Russian formalist, how they were concerned with the form of literary work than the subject matter, than the theme, than the content of a literary work. And they were concerned about what were the literary devices employed by the writers, that make it really worth calling a literary piece. And they were of the opinion that the more we delayed the process, the better would be the pleasure that a work would afford to the reader. Or it also says that a writer may employ different defamiliarization techniques to have the effect of literariness. That is, defamiliarization means making familiar things unfamiliar. Okay, using different methods. So with this, we just want criticism. Of course, this is somewhat related to Russian formalism. In the previous two sessions, we were discussing Russian formalism, the major tenets, principles of Russian formalism, and we have understood that the way Russian formalists approached a literary text, the way they try to read a literary text was different from how it had been read, how the literary text had been read by the previous critics. That means there were approaches like historical approach, where the historical details, the biographical details, the socio-political background of a literary work was very much important in interpreting a literary work. Or sometimes the critics, in fact, went back to the ideology that a particular author, in fact, subscribed, or the personal life led by a particular author was actually audited. So this was the thing, when you want to understand a literary text, you actually should go back to, the historical, personal, political, background of a literary work or the age in which that particular work has been produced. But new Russian formalists, in fact, approached literature from a different perspective, and they were of the view that literature is, of course, an autonomous entity. It doesn't have to take recourse to any other thing to interpret and to understand the meaning. The meaning lies within the text itself. So we need not go out of the text. So what the new Russian formalists generally did was, they basically talked about the form of literature. For them, form was more important than the content, than the subject matter, than the theme of a literary work, than the plot of a literary work. What was important was, for them, was how a plot was constructed, how a story was told, how a particular thing has been introduced there, what kind of language has been employed there. So these were the main concerns of the new Russian formalist. Okay, so and we were talking about what Klosky said, that the effect of defamiliarization and other literary devices as well. So in today's session, we will talk about new criticism, which more or less have the same principles in reading, in approaching a literary work. And we have already made a distinction between the Russian formalism and new criticism, because Russian formalism were basically about theorizing the style of literature, the form of literature, and how literature is different from other disciplines and other genres, etc. And therefore they talked about the form, the genre, the literary devices, etc. Things which are general in nature for all literatures, right? Whereas the new critics were basically looking at individual poems, individual works, and they applied this reading practice in their analysis of each individual text, like literary text. So there lies the basic difference, and also the country of origin and such details difference are also there, because we know that the Russian formalism obviously has its root in Russia, whereas this new criticism has its base in USA. Okay, though they are interconnected. So the term new criticism was coined as early as 1910 in a lecture that by that title by Joel Spingen, who influenced by Clauser's expressionist theory of art, advocated a creative and imaginative criticism which gave primacy to the aesthetic qualities of literature over historical, psychological, and moral considerations. See, because he was influenced by expressionist theory of art. There was something called expressionism. Of course, we all know what realism is all about. Realism is, just representing the external reality as it is. Just like literature is acting like a mirror that reflects the social reality, right? That is actually realism means. Whereas when we come to expressionism, especially in painting, architect, and all those things, it was so popular, more popular than perhaps in literature. Expressionist artists believed that this realism can only represent the external reality. So you actually wanted to represent the inner reality, for which you have to use different other techniques. For example, there is a particular painting, The Cry. If you just Google that, The Cry, you can find a particular painting where the distorted face of a girl who is crying, and that picture actually shows the trauma of the First World War. Okay, but had it been written in an ordinary way, just like a girl is crying with tears on her cheeks, that would not convey the deeper agony that that girl may have experienced at the time of the Second World War. So such paintings we may have seen, just color strokes here and there, and those are all expressionist paintings. So in drama also, many such dramatic theatrical techniques were used by the dramatist and dramaturgist, like the stage settings, the color, the light combination, many things. So they were trying to express the inner reality of the characters rather than the external reality. So dear students, please understand that expressionist theory of art means that one. So this actually has influenced the new criticism. That's a point I want to say, because which actually was giving primacy to the aesthetic qualities of literature over historical and psychological and moral considerations. Okay, this was already explained in the previous video on Russian formalism. We already talked about it, right? Historical considerations, like when we take a work, an individual author or an individual work, do not have to go back to the history of the age of the man who wrote that, or of the country in which that particular work has been produced. Okay, none of these things are necessary, and they did not be given importance or the psychological aspects or the moral considerations, like whether it was morally correct to portray things in such a way, or wasn't it immoral, or was it simply immoral? So such questions, beyond all these questions, what is more important for the new critics was the aesthetic qualities of literature. Okay, as I mentioned, in the video on Russian formalism, on the aesthetic movement and all these things. So, some of the important features of new criticism originated in England during 1920s. You can find such elements in the works of T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, as well as in the seminal studies by A. Richardson and William Epson. So their studies were quite familiar. We know that T.S. Eliot's, the traditional individual challenge. Ezra Pound has written many other things. He was also in the forefront of the images movement. And I.A. Richards is Principles of Literary Criticism, which came out in 1924, which in fact advanced the literary critical notions such as irony, tension, and balance, as well as distinguishing between poetics, the language of poetry, or the poetic use, and other uses of language. Especially, there is an essay called Two Uses of Language, where he actually speaks about these particular things, the emotic and the scientific use of language. Yes, so this is what we have to understand, and also is practical criticism, another groundbreaking work, which in fact tried to put into practice this new critical, the principles of new criticism, right? So these are the names that you may remember: T.S. Eliot and William Epson, also another person who wrote the seven types of ambiguity. Yes, then Richard's student William Epson, yes, this is what I was saying, produced an influential work, Seven Types of Ambiguity, which came out in 1930, and which is an example for, which is a model for the new critical practice of close reading, which was unearthing the inherent ambiguities of the text, and how it was trying to look at each and every tension, the statements which a text contains within itself. So this is just like Russian formalism, but one of the differences I've said, they were mainly focusing on, unlike the Russian formalists, they were mainly focusing on individual text, and they were for the closed reading. So John Constantine, urges that the emphasis of criticism must move from historical scholarship to aesthetic appreciation and understanding. Another new critic. So this has already been mentioned. Ransom's position is that a critic must study literature, not about literature. Okay. So according to John Branson, criticism should include first personal impressions, because critical activity should cite nature of the object rather than its effect upon the subject. So the synopsis or paraphrase, such things should be excluded. Yeah, we should not give importance to personal impressions, because already this has been replicated in the essay Traditional Individual Talent, where T.S. Eliot says that the less a poet expresses his feelings, the better that poem will be. Okay, poetry is not an expression of emotion, but an escape from emotion. So that idea is reflected here also. And coming to the second point, synopsis and paraphrase, or should be done away with. We should not include synopsis. We should not include paraphrase, because the plot or story is an abstraction from the real content of the text. Because how can I paraphrase a text? It is impossible, because when I read a text, I give a paraphrase to something, which is actually my own interpretation of that text, and I just rewrite it in an ordinary language, right? That is paraphrasing. But actually, when another person reads that text, he or she reads it in a different way, and she gets the meaning in a different way, perhaps. So my meaning would be contradictory to what the other person has felt it to be. So therefore, the meaning of the text, like, right? So the point is this, paraphrasing and synopsis. Synopsis means just write a summary of something. Again, that's really not a desirable practice, because when I try to summarize, I would try to include only those things which I feel important in that story, whereas when another person summarize, maybe when another person tries to summarize a text, he or she may include certain things which I've actually excluded. So therefore, if yes, that's also to be excluded, means synopsis and paraphrasing. Then thirdly, which is very obvious, historical studies, like literary background. For example, when we take a poem from which was written in the second half of the 18th century, or the beginning, the first of the 20th century, I mean 19th century, we cannot just read it in the backdrop of the Romantic movement there. Or a poem which was written in the Victorian period should not be read in the Victorian socio-political background. Okay, or the biography of the author need not be connected to a work that is written by an author. Literary sources, analogs. These things are to be avoided, excluded. And this is what the new critics were doing. So that's all about these things. This is just a summary of what new critics were doing with the text. And in your syllabus, you are not expected to go in detail about these kind of things. Only reading possibilities are expected. So just be familiar with this. With this, we would wind up this brief session on new criticism. Thank you.